There is a quiet habit that shapes more of a person's life than almost anything else, and most people never notice it operating inside them. It is the habit of measuring oneself against others, of quietly ranking one's own worth beneath the confidence, the success, or the approval of someone else. This habit does not announce itself loudly. It appears in small moments, in the instinct to defer, to shrink, to assume that someone else's opinion carries more weight than one's own judgment. Over time, this quiet deference becomes a ceiling, and a person spends years standing beneath a level they were always capable of reaching. But there is another way to live, one where admiration no longer curdles into inferiority, where respect for others no longer requires the abandonment of self-respect. In this audiobook, you will discover why this pattern forms, what it silently costs, and how a person moves from looking upward at others to standing steadily at their own level, not through arrogance, but through a quiet and permanent recalibration of how they see themselves. Chapter 1. The invisible ladder everyone is standing on. Somewhere beneath conscious thought, most people carry a ladder that no one built for them, and no one asked them to climb. It is not made of wood or steel. It is made of comparisons, quiet ones, formed in the space between a glance at someone else's life and a glance back at their own. On this ladder, certain people always seem to stand a few rungs higher. A colleague who speaks with more certainty. A relative who seems to have arrived somewhere the rest of the family has not. A stranger online whose composure looks effortless from a distance. The mind places them above, and without ever announcing the decision, it places the self below. This ladder is invisible because it is never drawn, never spoken aloud, never chosen with intention. It simply accumulates, rung by rung, through years of small measurements. And because it is invisible, it is rarely questioned. A person can spend an entire life standing on a lower step, deferring, shrinking, waiting for permission that never needed to be requested, and never once noticed the structure beneath their own feet. Before anything can change, the ladder must first be seen. That seeing is where every transformation in this journey begins. Chapter 2. Where looking up begins. No one is born believing they stand beneath another person. That belief is built, slowly, out of ordinary moments that seemed harmless at the time. A child is corrected in front of others, and learns that certainty belongs to someone else. A student is praised for one talent, and quietly concludes that other talents belong exclusively to other people. A young adult watches someone confident command a room, and absorbs, without meaning to, the idea that such command is a rare gift rather than a learnable posture. Admiration is not the problem. Admiration, in its original form, is simply recognition of something worth noticing in another person. But admiration has a quiet tendency to drift. What begins as this person does something, well, slowly becomes, this person is simply more than I am. The shift is almost imperceptible because it happens through feeling rather than through argument. No one decides, in a single moment, to rank themselves below another human being. It happens gradually, through repetition, until looking up has become so familiar that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like the truth. Chapter 3. The difference between respect and reverence. Respect and reverence often wear the same expression, which is why they are so easily confused. Respect says, I recognize something valuable in you, and I remain whole while recognizing it. Reverence says something quieter and far more costly. I recognize something valuable in you, and in doing so, I make myself smaller. The first response leaves a person intact. The second slowly hollows them out. Respect can coexist with equality. A person can respect a mentor's experience, a leader's discipline, or a friend's courage without surrendering their own sense of standing. Reverence, by contrast, requires a hierarchy to survive. It needs someone above and someone below, and it quietly assigns the lower position to the one doing the admiring. This is why reverence so often feels like devotion, but functions like erosion. It does not simply appreciate another person's strength. It borrows meaning from that strength at the expense of one's own. Learning to tell these two responses apart is not a small distinction. It is the difference between a life that grows through admiration and a life that gradually disappears beneath it. Chapter 4. The cost of a borrowed ceiling. Every person carries some internal sense of what is possible for them. A felt boundary that quietly governs which opportunities feel reachable and which feel absurd before they are even attempted. When a person spends years looking upward at others, that boundary does not stay neutral. It bends downward, shaped not by evidence of what the person is actually capable of, but by an unexamined belief that certain levels of confidence, success, or presence belong to other kinds of people. This borrowed ceiling rarely announces itself as limitation. It disguises itself as realism, as humility, as simply knowing one's place. A partner will decline to speak up in a meeting, not because they lack the insight, but because somewhere inside, a higher-ranked voice has already been assigned to someone else in the room. They will hesitate to pursue an opportunity, not because they are unqualified, but because they have quietly filed it under the category of things that happen to other, more capable people. The tragedy of a borrowed ceiling is that it is never tested. It simply governs, silently, for years, and the life lived beneath it never learns how much higher it could have reached, because it never seriously tried. Chapter 5. Why comparison feels like information but isn't. The mind treats comparison as though it were a measuring instrument, something objective and reliable, capable of producing an accurate reading of where a person stands relative to everyone around them. This feels true because comparison arrives dressed as observation. A person notices another's success, another's confidence, another's apparent ease, and the mind interprets this noticing as data, as though it has genuinely calculated something meaningful about relative worth. But comparison is not a measuring instrument. It is closer to a distorted mirror, one that reflects almost nothing about the person doing the looking and very little that is complete about the person being observed. Consider what comparison actually has access to. It sees a finished result and calls it the whole story. It sees someone's public composure and assumes that composure extends into every room that person has ever stood in. It sees a single visible achievement and silently multiplies it into a general verdict about capability, intelligence, or worth. What comparison almost never sees is the version of that person struggling in private, doubting their choices, recovering from failures that never became public. It does not see the years of unglamorous repetition that preceded the moment being observed. It sees an edited frame and treats it as an unedited film. This selective vision is not accidental. It is how the mind is built to process information about status. Human beings evolved in small groups where knowing one's relative standing carried real survival value, where understanding who held influence and who did not shaped access to safety, resources, and belonging. That ancient wiring did not disappear when the world changed. It simply found new material to work with. And today it works overtime on social feeds, workplace hierarchies, and casual encounters with strangers, generating a constant, low-grade stream of rankings that feel urgent and important, but are almost entirely manufactured. The deeper problem is that comparison always compares mismatched categories. It measures someone else's highlight against one's own full and unfiltered experience. It measures a stranger's outward performance against an intimate, close-up knowledge of every private doubt, every unfinished project, every quiet insecurity that never leaves the room. No comparison conducted this way could ever be fair, because the two sides being weighed were never equivalent to begin with. One side is a curated result. The other side is a complete, textured life, seen from the inside with all its unresolved edges still visible. And yet the feeling that follows a comparison is powerful, precisely because it does not feel like a distortion. It feels like a conclusion arrived at through direct evidence. Someone appears more capable, and the mind quietly files this as fact, rather than as an artifact of limited information. Over time, these accumulated verdicts begin to calcify into identity. A person does not simply think, that individual seems confident today. They think, I am not the kind of person who has that. The comparison has stopped being an observation about a moment, and has become, without permission, a statement about a self. Recognizing comparison for what it actually is does not mean pretending that other people's achievements or qualities do not exist. It means understanding that noticing a quality in someone else provides almost no reliable information about one's own capacity, history, or potential. It means treating every comparative judgment with the same skepticism one would apply to a rumor rather than the certainty one would grant to a verified fact. Once this skepticism becomes habitual, comparison loses much of its authority. It can still occur, but it no longer arrives disguised as truth. It arrives as what it always was, an incomplete glance, mistaken for a verdict. Chapter 6. The people you elevate without realizing it. Not every person becomes a fixed point on someone's internal ladder. Most pass through awareness briefly and leave no lasting trace on how a person measures themselves. But certain individuals, for reasons that are rarely examined, become permanent reference points, quiet benchmarks against which countless future moments are unconsciously measured. Understanding how these particular figures earn that position is essential, because until they are identified by name, their influence continues to operate in the dark. Often these figures are chosen not because they are objectively the most accomplished people a person has encountered, but because they arrived at a formative moment when identity itself was still being assembled. A teacher whose approval once felt like the entire measure of worth. An older sibling whose competence became, without discussion, the standard the younger sibling would spend decades trying to reach. A first boss whose sharp judgment shaped what confidence itself was supposed to sound like. These early reference points are rarely chosen consciously. They are absorbed during a period when the mind was especially porous, and that absorption gives them a kind of permanent residency that later, more rational relationships never quite achieve. Public figures occupy a different, but equally powerful category. A person may never meet the individual they have elevated, yet that stranger's visible success becomes a silent standard, applied to private decisions years later. This works because distance removes friction. An admired public figure, seen only through curated appearances, never contradicts the elevated image with an ordinary, unimpressive moment, because those moments are simply never shown. The absence of contradiction allows the elevation to remain intact indefinitely, untouched by the kind of complicating detail that close relationships inevitably introduce. There is also a category of quieter, elevation that deserves particular attention, the peer who becomes an unspoken rival without either party acknowledging it. This is the colleague whose promotions are tracked more closely than one's own progress. The friend whose relationship, home, or apparent ease becomes the silent backdrop against which a person's own life feels perpetually behind. These figures are dangerous precisely because they are close enough to feel like fair comparisons, while still being distant enough that their private struggles remain invisible. The unfairness identified earlier, comparing an edited outside to a complete inside, becomes even more distorting when the person being compared is someone encountered daily, because the illusion of familiarity makes the comparison feel earned rather than manufactured. Identifying these figures by name is not an exercise in resentment. The goal is not to diminish anyone's genuine accomplishments or to search for hidden flaws that would make the elevation feel unjustified. The goal is far simpler and far more useful. It is to notice, with precision, who currently occupies a fixed position above the self in one's own mind, and to ask a single honest question about each one. Was this position earned through complete evidence, or was it assigned early, absorbed without examination, and left unchallenged ever since? Most people discover, once they look closely, that the figures elevating the highest walls around their own self-regard are not extraordinary in any way that would justify a permanent hierarchy. They are simply the first names the mind reached for during a formative moment, and no one has thought to ask, since then, whether that assignment still deserves to stand. Chapter 7. The anatomy of feeling beneath someone. The feeling of being beneath another person rarely arrives as a clear thought. It arrives as a sensation first, a subtle contraction in the chest, a quickening of self-consciousness, an urge to shrink or defer that appears before any reasoning has taken place. Understanding this feeling requires taking it apart carefully, because what feels like a single unified experience is actually the product of several distinct mental processes operating together, each of which can be examined and, eventually, interrupted. The first component is a kind of instant, unconscious estimation. Before a person has gathered any real evidence, the mind performs a rapid calculation based on surface cues, the way someone speaks, the confidence in their posture, the reputation preceding them into the room. This calculation happens in a fraction of a second and produces a felt ranking, long before conscious thought has had any opportunity to intervene. Because it happens so quickly, it feels less like a judgment and more like a perception, something simply noticed rather than something constructed. This is the first illusion within the feeling of inferiority. It presents itself as observation, when it is in fact an extremely fast and extremely limited guess. The second component is selective memory. Once the initial estimation has occurred, the mind begins searching for evidence to support it, and it finds that evidence disproportionately in the past. A person feeling small in the presence of someone impressive will often experience a sudden, unbidden parade of their own past failures, moments of awkwardness, decisions they regret, mistakes long since resolved but never fully released. This parade feels like relevant context, but it is not context at all. It is confirmation bias, operating at emotional speed, mining the personal archive for anything that will justify the feeling the estimation has already produced, while conveniently ignoring the equally real archive of competence, growth, and accomplishment sitting in the same mind. The third component, and perhaps the most consequential, is anticipatory shrinking. Once a person feels beneath someone, The body and voice begin adjusting before any interaction has even required it. Posture softens. Eye contact becomes more tentative. Sentences begin trailing upward into questions rather than landing as statements. This is not a conscious performance. It happens automatically, an ancient physical response calibrated to signal deference to whoever the mind has determined holds greater standing. The trouble is that this shrinking is visible. Other people register it, even if only unconsciously, and they often respond to it by unconsciously assuming a more dominant posture in return, which then appears to confirm the original feeling. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing, not because the hierarchy was ever real, but because the shrinking created behavior that made it look real. The fourth component is a quiet reinterpretation of the other person's neutral behavior. Once inferiority has taken hold, ordinary actions from the elevated figure begin to be read through a distorted lens. A brief response is read as dismissal. A pause is read as judgment. A neutral expression is read as disapproval. None of these interpretations are supported by actual evidence. They are projections generated by the emotional state itself, then mistaken for accurate readings of another person's intentions. This reinterpretation deepens the original feeling further, creating a closed loop in which the emotion manufactures the evidence that then appears to justify the emotion. What makes this entire sequence so difficult to interrupt is its speed. All four components can unfold within seconds, long before a person has consciously registered that anything has happened at all. By the time the feeling reaches full conscious awareness, it already feels complete, already feels like an accurate and settled conclusion about relative worth, rather than the product of a rapid estimation, a biased memory search, an involuntary physical adjustment, and a distorted reading of someone else's behavior. Naming these four components individually is the beginning of dismantling their combined power. A person who understands that the initial estimation is a guess, that the memory search is selective, that the shrinking is an automatic reflex rather than an honest signal, and that the reinterpretation of the other person's behavior is a projection rather than a fact, gains something valuable. They gain the ability to notice the feeling arising without immediately accepting its verdict. The feeling may still appear. It may always appear, at least at first, in the presence of certain people or certain rooms. But once its mechanics are visible, it no longer arrives as unquestionable truth. It arrives as a familiar pattern, recognizable, and therefore, for the first time, something that can be met with distance rather than obedience. Chapter 8. Status is a story, not a fact. There is a quiet assumption sitting beneath most experiences of feeling beneath another person. An assumption so deeply embedded that it rarely gets examined directly. It is the belief that status is real in the same way that height or weight is real, an objective, measurable property that certain people simply possess in greater quantity than others. This belief feels self-evident because status behaves in daily life as though it were a fact. People respond to it, defer to it, organize entire rooms around it. But behaving like a fact and being a fact are not the same thing, and the distinction matters enormously for anyone attempting to stop looking upward at others. Bot 80, examined closely, turns out to be closer to currency than to gravity. Currency has no inherent value. A piece of paper is not worth anything by its own physical properties. It is worth something only because a sufficiently large group of people has agreed, mostly without ever discussing it explicitly, to treat it as valuable. The moment that collective agreement weakens, the currency's value changes, or disappears entirely, even though the paper itself has not changed at all. Status operates by the same mechanism. A title, a reputation, a visible marker of success carries weight only because the people around it have agreed, largely unconsciously, to grant it weight. Change the room, change the culture, change the era, and the same qualities that commanded deference in one context become unremarkable, or even irrelevant in another. This becomes obvious the moment it is examined across different settings. A person whose expertise commands total authority within a specific professional field may walk into an unrelated context, a family gathering, a hobbyist community, a foreign country, and find that the same credentials produce no difference whatsoever. Because the local agreement about what constitutes status has never included that particular currency, the person has not changed. Their competence has not diminished. What has changed is simply the story being told, collectively, by the people around them, about what matters and who embodies it. Status, in other words, is not a property of the person holding it. It is a property of the audience granting it, and audiences change constantly, which means the status they grant is never as fixed as it feels from the inside. This instability becomes even clearer across time. Qualities that once commanded enormous social deference in earlier eras, certain forms of physical strength, certain family lineages, certain rigid social manners, have lost most of their power in the present, not because those qualities disappeared, but because the collective story about their importance changed. Conversely, qualities that carry significant status today, particular kinds of digital visibility, particular professional titles, particular aesthetic presentations, will almost certainly lose some or all of their current weight within a few generations as the story shifts again. If status were a genuine fact about human worth, it would not be this volatile. Facts do not evaporate because fashions change. Stories do. None of this means that skill, competence, or genuine achievement are illusions. A surgeon's steady hands are real. A craftsman's decades of refined technique are real. The underlying capability that often accompanies elevated status can be entirely genuine and hard-earned. What is not real, or at least not fixed, is the automatic ranking of human worth that gets attached to that capability. Competence in one domain says nothing reliable about a person's worth as a whole, and yet the mind constantly performs this unearned leap, treating demonstrated skill in a narrow area as though it were evidence of a broader, more fundamental superiority. The surgeon's steady hands do not make them a better judge of character than the person watching from the waiting room. The craftsman's technique does not make their opinions on unrelated matters more valid. The leap from skilled at this to superior overall is where the story quietly takes over from the fact. Understanding status as a shared story rather than a fixed fact does not require dismissing the real achievements of others, nor does it require pretending that social hierarchies have no practical consequences in daily life. They clearly do, and ignoring that would be its own kind of distortion. What it requires is a more precise kind of attention, the ability to separate what is actually demonstrated, a skill, a body of work, a track record, from what is merely assumed, a general sense of superiority that the mind has quietly attached to that skill without any real justification. Once this separation becomes habitual, a person can continue to respect genuine competence wherever they find it, without automatically translating that respect into a diminished sense of their own standing. They can admire the craft without accepting the story that says admiration requires kneeling. The deepest freedom in this recognition is not the discovery that status does not matter. Status will continue to shape rooms, conversations, and opportunities for as long as human beings live in groups. The deeper freedom is realizing that the particular position assigned to any individual within that shifting story, including the position assigned to oneself, was never permanent, never fully earned by fixed truth, and never beyond the reach of revision. A story that changes across rooms, across cultures, and across centuries is not a verdict. It is simply the current draft of an ongoing narrative, and every person retains far more authority over their own place within it than the feeling of inferiority ever allows them to believe. Chapter 9. The difference between learning from someone and living beneath them. There is a particular kind of confusion that keeps many people trapped in unnecessary deference, and it deserves careful separation before any further progress can be made. It is the confusion between learning from another person and living beneath them, two experiences that can look remarkably similar from the outside, but produce entirely different internal outcomes over time. Mistaking one for the other is not a minor error. It is the mechanism that keeps admiration curdling into diminishment, long after any genuine learning has stopped taking place. Learning from someone is, by its nature, temporary and directional. It involves recognizing that another person possesses a specific skill, a particular body of experience, or a way of seeing that one does not yet possess, and deliberately absorbing what is useful from that recognition. Learning has a clear internal logic. Attention is paid, something is extracted, and the learner becomes, gradually, more capable than they were before. Crucially, learning is meant to close a gap. Its entire purpose is to make the difference between the two people smaller over time, not to preserve it indefinitely. A person who studies a mentor's judgment is meant to eventually develop their own judgment, tested against reality rather than borrowed from another mind. When learning functions correctly, it is self-eliminating. It exists in order to no longer be necessary. Living beneath someone operates by an entirely different logic, one that does not close the gap, but preserves it, often permanently. This posture is not about extracting a specific skill. It is a general orientation of the self, a constant, low-grade assumption that the other person's judgment, presence, or worth simply outranks one's own. Regardless of the specific situation, it does not ask what can be learned and then applied independently. It asks for continued deference, continued validation, continued permission. A person living beneath someone else does not graduate from the relationship the way a genuine learner eventually does. They remain, indefinitely, in the position of the smaller party, long after any practical reason for that position has expired. The distinction becomes clearer when examined through a simple test. Does the admiration, over time, expand the admirer's own capability and confidence? Or does it quietly require the admirer to stay smaller in order for the relationship to feel stable? Genuine learning tends to produce a strange but healthy symptom, a growing, sometimes uncomfortable, sense of independence from the very person being learned from. The student begins disagreeing occasionally. The apprentice begins developing instincts the mentor never explicitly taught. This independence is not a betrayal of the learning relationship, it is its intended outcome. Living beneath someone produces the opposite symptom. Independence feels threatening rather than natural. Disagreement feels dangerous rather than healthy. The relationship seems to require the smaller party to remain smaller, because the entire structure was never built around growth. It was built around a fixed hierarchy that both parties consciously or not, have an interest in preserving. This is why so many people describe a strange discomfort when they begin to outgrow someone they once looked up to. If the relationship had been one of genuine learning, this outgrowing would feel like a natural and even satisfying conclusion. The way a student eventually feels proud, rather than guilty, about surpassing certain aspects of a teacher's original instruction. But when the relationship has quietly become one of living beneath, outgrowing it feels like a violation of an unspoken agreement, and this discomfort is often mistaken for disloyalty or ingratitude, when it is actually a sign that something structurally unhealthy is finally being corrected. It is worth being honest about how easily one of these postures slides into the other. Nearly every instance of living beneath someone began as legitimate learning. A mentor's early guidance was genuinely valuable, genuinely worth the initial deference required to absorb it. The distortion happens gradually. When the deference required in the beginning, appropriate for a genuine beginner, is never renegotiated as competence grows. The mentor's authority, once earned through demonstrated expertise in a narrow domain, quietly expands in the student's mind into a general authority over the student's worth as a whole. No single moment marks this expansion. It happens the way most internal ladders form, through accumulation rather than decision, until years later, a person finds themselves still deferring to someone whose actual advantage, if it still exists at all, may now be limited to a single narrow area, while the deference has spread to cover everything. Correcting this confusion does not require rejecting mentors, admired figures, or genuine expertise. It requires a periodic, honest audit of every relationship in which deference has become habitual, asking a direct question about each one. What, specifically, is still being learned here? And is that learning actively closing the gap? Or has the relationship quietly settled into a permanent hierarchy that no longer serves any developmental purpose? Where genuine learning is still occurring, the deference remains appropriate, temporary, and self-eliminating by design. Where it is not, what remains is not respect. It is a habit of smallness, inherited from an earlier and more dependent version of the self, still being paid out long after the debt was settled. The goal, ultimately, is not to stop learning from other people. Learning from others, when it functions as intended, is one of the fastest paths toward genuine capability a person has available. The goal is to ensure that every act of learning remains in service of eventual equality rather than permanent subordination, so that admiration can do what it was always meant to do, lift a person toward the level they are admiring, rather than quietly convincing them that the level was never theirs to reach. Chapter 10. Why your own level is not fixed. Most people carry an unspoken assumption about their own standing that they would never state aloud, but nonetheless treat as settled. They assume that their level, their capability, their presence, their worth relative to others, is something roughly fixed, a stable quantity discovered somewhere in adolescence or early adulthood, and carried unchanged ever since. This assumption feels reasonable because it is rarely tested directly. A person does not wake up one morning and consciously decide how capable they are. The number, if it can even be called that, simply accumulates in the background, and once it settles into a felt sense of "this is roughly who I am," it tends to calcify, resistant to updating even when the evidence around it changes dramatically. This calcification is worth examining closely, because it is not a neutral or harmless habit of mind. A person who believes their level is fixed will interpret every new piece of evidence through that fixed belief, rather than allowing the evidence to genuinely revise it. Success becomes a pleasant anomaly rather than proof of growth, quickly explained away as luck, timing, or the unusual generosity of circumstance. Failure, by contrast, becomes confirmation, treated as evidence that the original, fixed assessment was correct all along. This asymmetry means that a person operating from a fixed sense of their own level can accumulate years of genuine growth and somehow emerge from that period, still feeling, underneath it all, exactly as small as they did at the beginning. The growth was real. The belief simply refused to update in response to it. The truth, verifiable by almost anyone willing to look honestly at their own history, is that a person's level is one of the least fixed things about them. Skills once considered impossible become routine. Confidence once entirely absent in certain situations becomes available, sometimes quickly, once genuine practice accumulates. Standards that once felt like permanent ceilings turn out, on closer inspection, to have been temporary limitations of experience, rather than permanent facts of identity. Anyone who has ever looked back at an earlier version of themselves and felt genuine surprise at how much has changed has already experienced direct, personal evidence against the idea of a fixed level. The surprise itself is the proof. If the level had truly been fixed, there would be nothing to be surprised about. What makes this especially important, within the specific problem of looking upward at others, is that a fixed sense of one's own level makes comparison feel far more dangerous than it actually is. If a person believes their own capability is essentially set, then encountering someone who appears more capable feels like a permanent, structural verdict, a discovery of where the ceiling has always been, rather than a snapshot of two people at two different points, along two entirely different, ongoing trajectories. This is why comparison so often produces despair, rather than motivation in people who hold a fixed view of their own potential. The gap they are observing feels unbridgeable because their own side of the equation has already been mentally sealed shut. A person who instead understands their level as something dynamic, still actively forming, experiences the exact same comparison very differently. The same gap that once felt like proof of permanent inferiority becomes, instead, simply a measurement of distance at a single point in time, informative rather than devastating. This does not mean every gap can or should be closed. It means the gap is no longer treated as a verdict about identity, only as a description of current position, which is an entirely different and far less crushing category of information. It is worth being precise about what actually causes a person's level to shift over time, because vague optimism about growth is not particularly useful without some understanding of the mechanism. Level shifts primarily through accumulated, repeated exposure to situations that were once uncomfortable, until that discomfort gradually diminishes and eventually disappears. A person who once felt entirely unqualified to speak in a room of experts, and who continues placing themselves in similar rooms despite that discomfort, does not remain unqualified forever. The exposure itself does the work, slowly and often invisibly, recalibrating what feels normal, what feels manageable, and eventually what feels genuinely easy. This is not a mystical process. It is closer to the way physical strength develops through repeated, gradually increasing resistance, except the resistance here is psychological rather than muscular, and the adaptation, though slower to notice, is just as real. This has a significant implication for anyone who has spent years believing their own level was permanently lower than the people they admire. If level shifts, primarily through exposure rather than through some fixed allocation of talent handed out at birth, then the actual gap between an admired figure and the person admiring them is often far more a function of accumulated hours spent in uncomfortable, unfamiliar territory than of any inherent difference in worth or capability. The admired figure was, in nearly every case, once just as uncertain, just as unpolished, standing in a version of the same discomfort the admirer currently feels. What separates the two is not a fixed gap in fundamental worth. It is simply a difference in how many hours have been logged inside that particular discomfort, a difference that time and deliberate exposure can meaningfully close. None of this suggests that growth is instantaneous, effortless, or guaranteed simply by wanting it. Genuine development still requires deliberate effort, honest feedback, and a willingness to remain in uncomfortable situations long enough for adaptation to occur. But the underlying premise that a person's current level represents some fixed and final truth about their ultimate capability does not survive careful examination. What survives is a more accurate and considerably more empowering understanding. Level is a snapshot, not a sentence. It describes where a person currently stands, not where they are permanently required to remain. And once this distinction becomes genuinely internalized, rather than merely understood intellectually, the entire practice of looking upward at others begins to lose its former weight, because the ladder itself is revealed to be something far more temporary and far more climbable than it ever appeared from below. Chapter 11. The quiet confidence of self-reference. There exists a specific and largely unrecognized shift available to anyone willing to make it, a shift from measuring the self against other people to measuring the self against its own prior state. This shift, small as it sounds when described plainly, changes almost everything about how confidence is built, sustained and experienced day to day. It deserves to be understood in detail because it is not simply a mindset trick or a comforting reframe. It is a fundamentally different system for generating a sense of one's own worth, one that operates on entirely different fuel than the comparative system most people default to without ever choosing it deliberately. The comparative system, examined earlier in this journey, generates a sense of worth by locating the self on a shared ladder alongside other people, and it depends, structurally, on external inputs that are entirely outside a person's control. It requires knowing where others stand, requires those positions to remain visible, and requires the gap between self and others to feel favorable in order to produce anything resembling confidence. This system is inherently unstable, not because of any personal failing in the person using it, but because its raw material, the visible positions of other people, is constantly shifting, often invisible in its full detail, and frequently distorted in exactly the ways explored earlier. A person relying on this system for their sense of worth is, in effect, outsourcing their confidence to a market they do not control and cannot fully see. Self-reference operates on entirely different material. Instead of asking, "How do I compare to that other person?" it asks a much narrower and far more answerable question. How do I compare to where I stood before? This question has a genuine advantage that comparative measurement can never offer, because the person asking it has complete, direct, unmediated access to the answer. There is no need to guess at another person's private struggles, no need to filter through curated highlights, no need to account for context that might make an external comparison unfair. The evidence is entirely internal, entirely available, and entirely honest, because no one is better positioned to know what a person's own capability, confidence, or clarity looked like a year ago than that same person. Examining their own memory, this shift produces a different emotional texture almost immediately. Progress measured against a former self tends to feel earned in a way that progress measured against another person rarely does, because there is no ambiguity about causation. When a person notices they can now handle a conversation that once made them anxious, or complete a task that once felt impossible, or remain calm in a situation that once triggered panic, the improvement is unambiguously theirs. It cannot be explained away as luck, or attributed to someone else's misfortune, or dismissed as merely average compared to some more impressive outside benchmark. It simply is what it is. Measurable, personal, undeniable evidence of growth, sourced entirely from within the person's own history. There is also a practical advantage to self-reference that deserves specific attention because it directly addresses one of the most exhausting features of comparative thinking. Comparative measurement never actually finishes, because there is always another person further along, another achievement more impressive, another version of success that makes the current one look modest by contrast. This creates a treadmill effect in which even genuine accomplishment produces only brief satisfaction before attention shifts to the next higher rung on the ladder, and the underlying feeling of insufficiency simply relocates rather than resolving. Self-reference does not eliminate ambition or the desire to keep improving, but it removes the treadmill's particular cruelty, because progress against one's own baseline is always, by definition, actual progress, regardless of how many other people remain further along some external, comparative scale. A person can simultaneously acknowledge that others have reached further while still recognizing, with full legitimacy, that their own movement forward is genuine and worth acknowledging on its own terms. Building this habit requires a specific and deliberate practice, because the comparative system is the default the mind reaches for automatically, given how deeply it is wired into social cognition. Self-reference has to be actively cultivated, usually through some form of regular, honest reflection that creates an accurate record to measure against. This does not require elaborate journaling systems or complicated tracking methods, though those can certainly help. It requires, at minimum, periodic honest moments of asking a simple question. Compared to where I stood a meaningful period ago, what has genuinely changed? Not compared to some idealized future self who has not yet been earned, and not compared to another person's current position, but compared specifically and only to the documented, remembered reality of an earlier version of the self. It is worth addressing directly why this practice feels, to many people, oddly unfamiliar, or even slightly uncomfortable at first, despite its obvious logic. Comparative thinking has usually been reinforced since early childhood, through grading systems, rankings, competitive structures, and social feedback that constantly locate a person relative to others rather than relative to their own trajectory. Self-reference, by contrast, is rarely modeled explicitly, and often has to be built as a genuinely new habit, against the grain of years of comparative conditioning. This discomfort is not evidence that the practice is wrong. It is simply evidence that a different, less familiar system is being activated, one that has had far less practice time than the comparative system it is beginning to replace. Over time, as self-reference becomes more habitual, something notable happens to the experience of encountering other people's success or confidence. It does not disappear, as a category of observation. A person will still notice when someone else demonstrates impressive skill or composure. But the observation stops automatically converting into a verdict about personal worth, because worth is no longer being generated from that comparative source in the first place. Someone else's achievement can simply be noticed, perhaps even admired, without triggering the old automatic contraction, because the internal system generating confidence has quietly shifted its fuel source elsewhere, to a place entirely within the person's own reach, entirely within their own history, and entirely immune to the distortions that made external comparison so unreliable to begin with. Chapter 12. Releasing the need for external permission. Beneath the habit of looking upward at other people sits something even more foundational, a pattern so pervasive that it often goes entirely unnamed, even as it governs enormous portions of a person's decisions. It is the quiet expectation that permission must be granted by someone else before a thought can be trusted, an action can be taken, or a sense of worth can be claimed. This expectation rarely announces itself directly. It hides inside more socially acceptable language, inside phrases like waiting for the right moment, or wanting more feedback first, or not wanting to seem presumptuous. But underneath these reasonable-sounding explanations often sits a simpler and less flattering truth. A person does not yet feel authorized to proceed, and that authorization is being sought, consciously or not, from an external source rather than being claimed from within. This pattern forms early and reinforces itself continually, because much of formal life genuinely does operate through external permission during childhood and adolescence. A child requires permission to leave the table, permission to speak, permission to pursue certain choices. A student requires approval through grades, through the judgment of teachers, through structured evaluation that determines advancement. This is not, in itself, unhealthy. Some structured deference is appropriate for a person still developing judgment and experience. The difficulty arises when this structure, appropriate for a specific developmental stage, never gets consciously renegotiated as a person moves into adulthood, where the actual requirement for external permission drops dramatically, even though the internal habit of seeking it does not. The connection between this pattern and looking upward at others becomes clear once it is examined directly. A person who unconsciously believes their thoughts, actions, or worth require external ratification will naturally scan their environment for figures capable of providing that ratification, and will naturally elevate those figures, because elevating them is precisely what makes their approval feel meaningful enough to be worth seeking. This creates a subtle but important insight. Elevating other people is not merely a symptom of comparison. It is often an active, though unconscious, strategy for creating a source of permission. The higher someone is placed, the more their eventual approval feels like it settles the question of worth. This explains why the search for external permission and the habit of looking upward at others tend to travel together so consistently. They are, in a meaningful sense, the same underlying mechanism, viewed from two different angles. Recognizing this connection allows a more precise kind of self-observation. Instead of simply noticing, "I feel beneath this person," it becomes possible to notice the more specific and more revealing pattern underneath. I am waiting for this person to confirm something about myself that I have not yet confirmed on my own. This second observation is considerably more actionable than the first, because it points directly toward what actually needs to change. The problem was never really about the other person's elevated position. The problem was the outsourcing of a judgment that was always, structurally, the individual's own to make. It is worth being specific about what genuine self-permission actually involves, because the phrase can easily be misunderstood as encouragement toward recklessness or an unwillingness to accept legitimate feedback. Self-permission does not mean ignoring useful input from people with genuinely relevant experience. Nor does it mean proceeding with actions regardless of their actual quality or consequences. It means something more precise. It means that the fundamental question of whether one is allowed to act, allowed to speak, allowed to consider oneself capable, stops being outsourced entirely to another person's judgment and becomes, instead, a determination the individual is willing to make for themselves, informed by external input, but not permanently dependent on it. A person operating from genuine self-permission can still seek advice, still value expertise, still welcome correction. What changes is that none of these inputs function as a precondition for proceeding. They function as useful information within a decision the person has already claimed as their own to make. The discomfort that accompanies this shift deserves honest acknowledgement, because it is often significant enough to send people quietly back toward their old pattern of seeking permission, mistaking the discomfort for evidence that something has gone wrong. Claiming self-permission after years of outsourcing, it tends to feel exposed, even reckless, precisely because it removes a familiar layer of protection. If a decision was made only after receiving external approval, any resulting failure could always be partially attributed to that approval, a shared responsibility that softened the weight of the outcome. Self-permission removes this buffer entirely. The decision becomes fully one's own, the consequences fully one's own. And this full ownership, while ultimately far more empowering, initially feels considerably more vulnerable than the old, permission-seeking pattern ever did. This vulnerability is not a sign that self-permission is the wrong path. It is simply the natural sensation of taking on authority that was, for a long time, quietly delegated elsewhere. Much like a muscle that has rarely been used, the capacity for self-authorization tends to feel weak and uncertain in its early stages of exercise, not because the capacity is genuinely absent, but because it has been left dormant while external permission handled the work instead. The remedy is not to wait for the discomfort to disappear before acting. The remedy is to act in smaller, deliberate ways while the discomfort is still present, allowing the capacity to strengthen gradually through direct use. The same way any underused capability develops through repeated, graduated exposure rather than through waiting for confidence to arrive first. A useful practice, in this regard, involves noticing the specific moments when the impulse to seek external permission arises, and pausing before automatically acting on that impulse. In that pause, a simple but clarifying question can be asked. Is this genuinely a situation that requires someone else's specific expertise or authority, or is this a situation where permission is being sought simply because the habit of seeking it has never been examined? The honest answer, more often than a person initially expects, falls into the second category. Most of what feels like a need for external approval is, on closer inspection, a need for a feeling of safety that was never actually dependent on another person at all, only mistakenly attached to them through years of habitual deference. As self-permission becomes more familiar, the entire relationship to admired or elevated figures begins to change in a subtle but significant way. Their approval remains pleasant when offered, but it stops functioning as a prerequisite for moving forward. Their absence of approval, or even their explicit disapproval, stops functioning as a verdict, requiring reversal before action can be taken. This does not make a person indifferent to others' opinions. It makes them appropriately independent of a system that was never designed to serve them as well as their own considered judgment can. Once that judgment is finally allowed to operate without waiting for someone else to grant it the authority it already possessed. Chapter 13. Standing beside, not beneath. Every relationship that has been shaped by the habit of looking upward carries, embedded within it, an unspoken geometry, a felt sense of vertical position that governs how two people relate to one another long before any words are exchanged. One person stands above, whether through age, achievement, reputation, or simply the early accident of when the relationship began. The other stands below, adjusting posture, tone, and even opinion around that felt difference in elevation. This chapter is concerned with a specific and deliberate task, reimagining that vertical geometry as something horizontal instead, a shift from beneath to beside, and examining what actually changes, practically and internally, when this reimagining takes hold. It helps to begin by being precise about what standing beside someone actually requires, because the concept is easily misunderstood as either arrogance on one end or false modesty on the other. Standing beside a person does not mean claiming equal achievement, equal experience, or equal skill in every domain that person occupies. Two people standing beside each other can have wildly different levels of accomplishment in a particular field and still occupy a lateral, rather than vertical, relationship, because the lateral position refers not to comparative output, but to comparative personhood. It is the recognition that both individuals share the same fundamental standing as human beings, making their way through uncertainty, regardless of how unevenly their specific accomplishments happen to be distributed at any given moment. A senior professional and a newcomer to a field can occupy wildly different points on a skill ladder, while still standing beside each other. In the more fundamental sense that matters here, two people, equally entitled to their own judgment, equally deserving of respect, equally engaged in an ongoing process, neither of them has finished. This distinction between comparative output and comparative personhood resolves a confusion that often prevents people from attempting this reframe in the first place. Many assume that refusing to look upward at someone requires denying or minimizing that person's genuine accomplishments, as though equality of standing could only be achieved by pretending the gap in experience or skill does not exist. This is unnecessary and, in most cases, simply inaccurate. A person can fully acknowledge that another individual has accomplished more, learned more, or developed further in a specific area, while still refusing to translate that acknowledgement into a general, vertical ranking of overall worth. The accomplishment is real. The vertical ranking it seems to justify is the part that was never actually warranted, and separating these two things clearly is what makes standing beside someone possible, without requiring any dishonesty about their genuine capabilities. Practically, this reframe changes the texture of interaction in specific, noticeable ways. Consider the experience of disagreeing with someone who has previously occupied an elevated position in one's mind. From beneath, disagreement feels almost transgressive, a violation of the implicit hierarchy that has governed the relationship, and it often gets suppressed entirely, or delivered with such excessive hedging that the actual disagreement barely survives the delivery. From beside, disagreement becomes simply a difference of perspective between two people, each entitled to hold and express their own view, neither of whom is required to defer automatically, simply because one has more visible accomplishment in some unrelated or even related domain. This does not mean disagreement should be delivered carelessly or without appropriate humility about the limits of one's own knowledge. It means the disagreement is no longer preemptively silenced by an unexamined assumption about relative worth. The same shift changes how requests, questions, and even simple conversational contributions are offered. From beneath, a person often frames their own input apologetically, softened with unnecessary qualifiers, delivered as though seeking pre-approval, rather than simply contributing. From beside, the same input can be offered directly, not because it is guaranteed to be correct, but because offering a genuine perspective does not require prior authorization from someone standing at a higher rung. This does not produce arrogance, properly understood, because genuine lateral standing includes an honest acknowledgement of one's own limitations and an openness to being wrong. What it removes is not humility, but unnecessary self-erasure, the habit of shrinking a contribution's presence before it has even been evaluated on its actual merits. There is a particular category of relationship where this shift deserves special attention, because it tends to be the most resistant to change. Relationships that began, quite legitimately, in a vertical configuration, a mentor and a mentee, a senior figure and a newcomer, an established expert and a genuine beginner. These relationships often start vertical for good reason, and the initial deference within them is not a distortion but an appropriate response to a real temporary difference in experience. The difficulty, as explored earlier in this journey, is that this appropriate initial deference frequently outlives its usefulness, persisting long after the underlying gap in experience has narrowed or closed entirely, simply because the relationship's geometry was never consciously renegotiated. Renegotiating this geometry does not require an awkward, explicit conversation announcing the shift, though in some relationships such directness can be valuable. More often, the renegotiation happens through accumulated behavior rather than declared intention, through offering genuine disagreement when it is warranted, through making requests and contributions without excessive apology, through gradually testing whether the relationship can tolerate a more lateral configuration, and adjusting based on what is actually discovered, rather than what was assumed in advance. Some relationships, once tested, reveal that the other person was entirely open to this shift all along, and had simply been responding, unconsciously, to the vertical posture being offered to them. Other relationships reveal genuine resistance, an investment, on the other side, in maintaining the original hierarchy. This second discovery is itself valuable information, because it distinguishes between relationships worth continuing to renegotiate and relationships whose vertical structure was never really about the specific gap in experience at all, but about a dynamic the other person has their own reasons for wanting to preserve. It is worth acknowledging that this entire reframe, standing beside rather than beneath, extends beyond any single relationship and gradually becomes a general orientation toward the world. A person who has genuinely internalized this shift does not need to consciously reframe every new encounter with an accomplished or impressive stranger. The lateral posture becomes the default, the automatic starting point, rather than something painstakingly constructed in each individual interaction. This does not eliminate admiration. admiration for genuine skill or character remains fully available, and in fact, becomes more genuine once it is no longer entangled with an automatic sense of personal diminishment. What disappears is only the reflexive contraction, the instinct to shrink first and evaluate second, replaced by a steadier default position, full engagement, full presence, full willingness to admire what deserves admiration. All of it conducted from a footing that never assumed, in the first place, that admiration required kneeling. Chapter 14. The discomfort of rising to your own level. There is an assumption, rarely examined directly, that claiming one's own level should feel good immediately. That the moment a person stops looking upward and begins standing at their actual height, relief, and confidence should follow naturally and without resistance. This assumption is understandable but inaccurate, and believing it can cause real damage, because when the actual experience turns out to be uncomfortable, rather than immediately liberating, many people interpret discomfort as proof that something has gone wrong, that the old, deferential posture must have been correct after all, and they quietly retreat back to familiar smallness, rather than pushing through what is, in fact, an entirely predictable and temporary phase of the process. Understanding why this discomfort arises requires looking honestly at what the old posture, however limiting, actually provided. Standing beneath others, for all its costs, offered a kind of psychological shelter. It removed the full weight of responsibility for one's own judgment, since deferring to a higher authority meant that authority, implicitly, carried some of the burden of being wrong. It offered a stable, if uncomfortable, sense of place, a known position within a known hierarchy, which is, for many people, easier to tolerate than the genuine uncertainty of an unranked, self-determined standing. And it provided, perhaps most significantly, an excuse. A person who has not yet claimed their own level can explain away failures, hesitations, and missed opportunities as the natural condition of someone still beneath, still not yet arrived, still waiting for a more legitimate future version of themselves to take over. Rising to one's own level removes all three of these protections simultaneously, and their sudden absence, rather than producing immediate relief, often produces a disorienting sense of exposure. This exposure deserves to be named specifically, because vague discomfort is much harder to tolerate than discomfort that has been clearly identified and understood. The first and most immediate form is the sudden weight of undiluted responsibility. When a person's judgment is no longer implicitly subordinate to someone else's, every decision becomes fully their own, without the comfortable diffusion that deference used to provide. This can feel, initially, less like empowerment, and more like standing suddenly alone in an open space after years of standing in the shelter of someone else's shadow. The shadow, however limiting, was also protective, and its removal is felt before its benefits are. The second form of discomfort involves the reaction of other people, which is rarely as smooth or automatically supportive as a person might hope. Relationships that were built, however unconsciously, around a particular hierarchy do not always adjust gracefully when one party begins occupying a different position within it. Some people who previously seemed to welcome the deference offered to them may respond to its withdrawal with subtle resistance, confusion, or even open irritation, not necessarily out of malice, but because the shift disrupts a pattern they had grown comfortable relying on, whether or not they ever consciously chose it either. This resistance can feel, to the person attempting to rise, like confirmation that their new posture is somehow wrong or unwelcome. when it is often simply evidence that other people need time to recalibrate their own expectations, a process that rarely happens instantly or without some friction along the way. A third and more internal form of discomfort deserves particular attention because it is easy to mistake for genuine doubt rather than what it actually is. An old, familiar voice reasserting itself out of habit rather than out of accuracy. As a person begins standing at their actual level, moments will arise in which the old feeling of smallness surfaces again, sometimes with surprising intensity, precisely in situations that most closely resemble the ones that originally trained that feeling into existence. This resurgence is not evidence that the underlying work has failed. It is closer to what happens when any long-standing physical habit is deliberately interrupted. A temporary intensification of the old pattern's pull, occurring precisely because the pattern is being actively challenged rather than passively reinforced as it always had been before. It is worth being direct about a particular danger hidden inside this discomfort, because it explains why so many genuine attempts at rising to one's own level quietly reverse themselves within a short period. The discomfort of standing at one's actual level is unfamiliar, and unfamiliar sensations are frequently and mistakenly interpreted by the mind as danger signals requiring immediate correction. A person feeling this unfamiliar exposure may conclude, often without fully realizing they have drawn this conclusion, that the discomfort itself is proof that the old, smaller posture was safer and therefore more accurate. This is a serious misreading. The discomfort is not a signal that something has gone wrong. It is a signal that something significant is finally changing. And change, even entirely positive change, reliably produces this kind of unfamiliar sensation before it produces ease, distinguishing between discomfort that signals genuine misalignment and discomfort that simply signals unfamiliar growth requires a specific kind of attention because the two can feel remarkably similar in the moment they occur. One useful distinction involves examining what the discomfort is actually asking of a person. Discomfort that signals genuine misalignment, a truly harmful decision, an ethical violation, a serious miscalculation, tends to point towards specific, identifiable problems that further reflection can usually name concretely. Discomfort that signals unfamiliar growth tends to be far vaguer, a general sense of exposure or uncertainty that does not resolve into any specific, nameable objection, no matter how closely it is examined. When discomfort remains vague under close inspection, resistant to being pinned down into any concrete concern, it is far more likely to be the second kind, the ordinary friction of an old pattern being challenged, rather than a genuine warning about a real mistake. The practical response to this discomfort is neither to suppress it forcefully nor to obey it automatically, but to remain in its presence deliberately, allowing it to be felt fully while continuing to act from the new, more accurate posture, regardless of how unfamiliar that posture currently feels. This is not a comfortable instruction, and it should not be presented as though it were. But it reflects an honest truth about how any meaningful internal shift actually occurs. Confidence at one's own level is not the precondition for standing there. It is the eventual result of having stood there, uncomfortably, long enough for the position to stop feeling foreign. The discomfort explored in this chapter is not an obstacle standing between a person and their rightful level. It is, in a very real sense, the exact texture of what rising to that level feels like from the inside, before it has had sufficient time to become the new and comfortable normal. Chapter 15. building an identity that does not look outward for its foundation. Every structure requires a foundation, and identity, though intangible, is no exception to this basic architectural principle. The question worth asking with real precision is not whether a person's sense of self rests on some foundation, because it always does, but rather what that foundation is actually made of, and whether it has the structural integrity to remain stable, regardless of what happens in the surrounding environment. For a person who has spent years looking upward at others, the foundation of identity has often been constructed, largely without deliberate design, from external material. The opinions of admired figures, the visible markers of comparative standing, the shifting approval of an audience whose judgment was never fully within the person's control. This chapter is concerned with the deliberate reconstruction of that foundation, replacing external material with something considerably more stable. The problem with an externally sourced foundation becomes clear the moment its structural weaknesses are examined directly. A foundation built from other people's opinions is only as stable as those opinions remain, and opinions, by their nature, are unstable, subject to mood, context, incomplete information, and simple human inconsistency. A foundation built from comparative standing is only as stable as one's position within a shifting hierarchy, a hierarchy explored earlier in this journey as a shared story rather than a fixed fact, meaning the foundation is, quite literally, built on a narrative that can and does change without warning. A person relying on either of these materials has constructed an identity that requires constant external maintenance, simply to remain standing, a foundation that must be continuously reinforced through fresh approval, fresh comparative victories, fresh evidence gathered from an environment that was never obligated to keep providing it. An internally sourced foundation operates by an entirely different logic, and building one requires identifying what actually qualifies as stable, internal material, since not everything that feels internal actually is. A person's specific achievements, for instance, though genuinely their own, do not make for a particularly stable foundation on their own, because achievements are finite events, existing in the past, vulnerable to being surpassed, forgotten, or simply insufficient to answer the question of worth on the difficult days when no achievement feels close enough at hand to draw upon. A foundation built primarily on past achievement tends to require an ever-growing supply of new achievement, simply to maintain its footing, which is its own form of exhausting external dependency, even though the achievements themselves were genuinely earned. What proves considerably more stable, on close examination, is something closer to a set of demonstrated internal processes rather than any specific external outcome. Consider, for instance, a person's demonstrated capacity to recover from failure, a capacity that, once genuinely proven to oneself through direct experience, does not require repeated reproving in order to remain trustworthy. A person who has weathered a genuine setback and found their way through it has acquired something durable, not because the specific setback matters any longer, but because the underlying capacity for resilience has been demonstrated as real. And that demonstration remains true regardless of whatever new challenge arrives next. This is meaningfully different from an achievement-based foundation, because the capacity for recovery does not expire the way a specific accomplishment eventually fades in relevance. It simply continues being true, quietly available as evidence every time it is needed again. Similarly stable is a person's demonstrated relationship with their own values, a track record, however imperfect, of having made decisions that align with what genuinely matters to them, even when those decisions were difficult or unpopular. This kind of evidence does not depend on any external audience recognizing or validating the decision. Its stability comes from the internal coherence between stated values and actual behavior, a coherence that can be assessed privately and does not require anyone else's agreement in order to remain valid. A person building their foundation on this kind of internal coherence is drawing on material that cannot be revoked by a change in someone else's opinion, because the material was never sourced from that opinion in the first place. There is also considerable stability available in a person's demonstrated capacity for honest self-assessment, the willingness to look clearly at both strengths and genuine limitations, without either inflating them defensively or exaggerating them into unwarranted self-criticism. This capacity, once developed, becomes a kind of internal compass that does not require external confirmation to function correctly, because its accuracy can be checked against reality directly through the ordinary feedback of consequences and outcomes, rather than through the far less reliable feedback of other people's approval or disapproval. A person who trusts their own capacity for honest self-assessment has less need to seek external verdicts about their worth, because they already possess a working internal instrument for that same purpose, one considerably more consistent than the shifting opinions of an outside audience. Building this kind of internally sourced foundation is not a single decision but an accumulated practice, developed gradually through the deliberate noticing and recording, whether formally or simply in memory, of the specific moments when these internal capacities have already demonstrated themselves. Most people, upon close reflection, discover that they already possess considerably more of this internal evidence than their habitual self-assessment has been giving them credit for. The work, in large part, is not creating this evidence from nothing, but recognizing evidence that already exists, evidence that has been consistently overshadowed by the louder, more immediately available, external material that comparative thinking and permission-seeking have trained a person to prioritize instead. It is worth being clear-eyed about the fact that this internal foundation, however stable, does not eliminate the value of genuine relationships, meaningful feedback, or authentic connection with other people. The goal of building an internally sourced identity is not isolation from the outside world, nor is it indifference to how one's actions affect others. It is simply the removal of a specific, unhealthy dependency, the dependency in which a person's basic sense of worth cannot survive without continuous external ratification. A person with a genuinely internal foundation can still deeply value connection, still seek and appreciate feedback, still care what others think in the ordinary, healthy sense of caring about relationships. What changes is that none of this external input is any longer required in order for the foundation itself to remain standing. The relationships become additions to an already stable structure, rather than the structure's only remaining support. As this internal foundation solidifies, something notable happens to the original habit that began this entire journey. The habit of looking upward at others and measuring the self as smaller by comparison. That habit, examined from this new, more stable footing, begins to lose much of its former power. Not because admired figures have become less impressive, but because the entire psychological function that comparison used to serve, providing an external verdict about worth, is no longer being outsourced to them in the first place. A person standing on genuinely internal ground does not need the comparison to resolve favorably in order to feel secure, because security was never sourced from that comparison to begin with. This is in the end what a stable foundation actually provides, not the elimination of an uncertain world, but a place to stand that remains steady regardless of what that world happens to be doing at any given moment. Chapter 16. What changes when you stop looking up? Every internal shift described throughout this journey eventually expresses itself in observable, practical ways, in the actual texture of daily decisions, relationships, and ambitions. This chapter is concerned with tracing those practical changes carefully, because understanding what actually shifts, in concrete terms, once a person stops looking upward at others, helps distinguish genuine transformation from mere intellectual agreement with an idea that has not yet reached the level of lived behavior. The first and most immediate change tends to appear in the texture of everyday conversation. A person who has stopped automatically ranking themselves beneath others begins speaking with a subtly different rhythm, not louder or more assertive in any performed sense, but steadier, less prefaced with unnecessary qualification, less shaped by an anticipatory concern about whether the listener will find the contribution worthy of their attention. This does not mean every statement becomes bold or certain. Genuine humility about the limits of one's own knowledge remains entirely appropriate and even valuable. What disappears is a specific, unnecessary layer, the reflexive softening that was never actually about intellectual humility, but about a felt need to pre-apologize for taking up space that was assumed, incorrectly, to belong more legitimately to someone else. A second significant change appears in the handling of disagreement, a theme that has surfaced throughout this journey, precisely because it serves as such a reliable indicator of a person's underlying sense of standing. Disagreement offered from beneath tends to arrive, wrapped in excessive hedging, sometimes so heavily qualified that the actual point being made becomes difficult to locate within all the surrounding softening. Disagreement offered from a person who has claimed their own level tends to be clearer, not harsher, simply more direct, because it no longer needs to negotiate its own legitimacy before being spoken. This shift often produces an unexpected side effect worth noting. People frequently respond with more genuine engagement and respect to a clearly stated disagreement than they ever did to the same underlying point, buried beneath layers of apologetic hedging, because clarity itself signals a kind of trustworthiness that excessive qualification tends to undermine, however unintentionally. A third change involves the handling of opportunity, particularly the specific moment when an opportunity presents itself that exceeds a person's previous, comfortable sense of their own level. Before this shift, such opportunities tend to trigger an automatic, often unexamined disqualification, a quiet, internal decision that the opportunity must belong to someone else, someone more legitimately positioned to pursue it, a decision made so quickly it rarely even registers as a decision at all. After genuinely internalizing the ideas explored throughout this journey, the same opportunity tends to be met with a more honest evaluation, one based on an accurate, current assessment of actual capability and interest, rather than an inherited, outdated sense of what a person like oneself is supposedly permitted to reach for. This does not mean every opportunity suddenly becomes appropriate to pursue. It means the initial filter shifts from an automatic ceiling to a genuine, individualized assessment, which naturally opens far more possibilities than the ceiling ever allowed to be seriously considered. A fourth and particularly significant change concerns the experience of being in the presence of someone genuinely accomplished or impressive. A scenario that, earlier in this journey, was identified as a common trigger for the entire pattern of feeling beneath another person. This experience does not disappear entirely, and it would be inaccurate to suggest that a person who has done this internal work becomes permanently immune to any flicker of comparative feeling in such moments. What changes is the duration and consequence of that flicker. Where the old pattern would allow a momentary comparative feeling to expand into a general, lingering sense of diminishment, coloring the entire interaction, and sometimes the following hours or days, the newer pattern tends to notice the flicker, recognize it for the automatic and largely unreliable reaction described earlier in this journey, and allow it to pass without granting it the authority to define the rest of the encounter. The impressive person remains genuinely impressive. The observer simply no longer automatically shrinks in response to that impressiveness. A fifth change, somewhat more subtle than the others, but no less significant, involves the relationship to one's own ambition. A person operating from beneath others tends to shape their ambitions around what feels appropriately modest for someone in their assumed position, often without ever consciously articulating this constraint, simply absorbing it as an unspoken boundary on what is reasonable to want. Once this boundary is examined and released, ambition often expands, not necessarily in scale, since scale was never the actual issue, but in honesty. A person becomes free to want what they genuinely want, evaluated on its own merits, rather than filtered through an inherited sense of what people at their assumed level are supposedly entitled to pursue. This honesty sometimes reveals ambitions considerably larger than the person had previously permitted themselves to acknowledge, and sometimes reveals, with equal validity, that certain previously assumed ambitions were never genuinely the person's own to begin with, having been adopted simply because they matched what someone at a higher, more impressive level was supposedly expected to want. A sixth change worth noting appears in the specific quality of relationships that begin to feel sustainable versus relationships that begin to feel increasingly untenable. Relationships that depended structurally on one party remaining smaller, examined earlier in this journey, through the distinction between learning from someone and living beneath them, often become noticeably more strained once that smallness is no longer being offered as consistently. Some of these relationships adapt, revealing that the other party was, in fact, capable of relating laterally all along, and had simply been responding to whatever posture was being presented to them. Other relationships reveal genuine incompatibility with the new, more lateral posture, a discovery that can feel initially uncomfortable, but is, in the longer view, considerably more valuable than continuing to maintain a relationship that required ongoing self-diminishment as its price of admission. Taken together, these changes do not describe a single, dramatic transformation occurring all at once, but rather a gradual and cumulative shift in the texture of ordinary daily experience. Conversations become steadier, disagreement becomes clearer, opportunity gets evaluated more honestly. Encounters with impressive people become lighter, less freighted with automatic diminishment. Ambition becomes more genuinely one's own. Relationships sort themselves according to whether they can tolerate genuine lateral standing or whether they required something smaller in order to function as they had before. None of these changes requires a person to become louder, more aggressive, or fundamentally different in temperament. They simply require the removal of a specific, long-standing distortion, the automatic assumption of a lower rung on a ladder that, as this entire journey has attempted to demonstrate, was never as fixed, as objective, or as necessary as it always felt from below. Chapter 17. The person who no longer measures themselves by others. It is worth pausing near the conclusion of this journey to construct a clear and honest picture of what this transformation actually looks like once it has settled fully into a person's character, not as an aspirational ideal, but as a realistic portrait, grounded in the mechanisms explored throughout every preceding chapter. This portrait matters because vague descriptions of confidence or self-assurance tend to blur into cliché, and clichés are of limited use to anyone attempting genuine, lasting change. What follows is an attempt at precision rather than inspiration, a description of specific, observable qualities rather than an abstract ideal difficult to translate into daily behavior. The person who has genuinely completed this internal shift does not experience the world as free of impressive people, remarkable achievements, or genuinely superior skill in specific domains. That world remains exactly as populated with excellence as it always was. What has changed is the internal processing of encountering that excellence, where the old pattern converted every instance of someone else's impressiveness into an automatic verdict about personal insufficiency. The new pattern processes the same information more accurately, recognizing skill as skill, achievement as achievement, without the unearned, automatic leap into a general ranking of overall worth. This person can watch someone perform brilliantly in a domain and feel genuine, uncomplicated admiration, entirely free of the old contraction that once accompanied admiration as an unwelcome but seemingly inevitable companion. This person has also developed a specific, reliable relationship with comparison itself, treating it not as a forbidden thought to be suppressed, but as a familiar, recognizable pattern to be met with informed skepticism whenever it arises. Comparison still occurs. It is a deeply wired feature of human cognition, and no amount of internal work eliminates it entirely. But it no longer arrives disguised as unquestionable truth. It arrives, instead, as a recognizable process, understood in its actual mechanics: the rapid estimation, the selective memory search, the automatic physical shrinking, the distorted reinterpretation of the other person's neutral behavior. Each of these components now visible rather than hidden, and therefore considerably easier to meet with distance rather than obedience. This person's confidence has a particular texture worth describing precisely, as it differs meaningfully from the confidence that comes from simply winning enough comparisons to feel temporarily superior to a sufficient number of people. That comparative confidence, examined earlier in this journey, is inherently unstable, dependent on a constantly shifting external scoreboard that can never be permanently secured. The confidence available to a person who has genuinely internalized self-reference instead rests on a considerably steadier foundation, built from documented, personal evidence of growth over time, from demonstrated capacity to recover from failure, from an honest and ongoing relationship with their own values and limitations. This confidence does not require other people to remain beneath them in order to survive. It does not depend, in other words, on anyone else's position at all. This person's relationships have also reorganized themselves in a manner consistent with everything explored earlier regarding standing beside rather than beneath. Mentorship, where it exists in their life, functions as genuine, temporary learning rather than permanent deference, marked by a visible willingness to eventually disagree with, question, or move beyond even deeply respected teachers, not out of disrespect, but out of the natural completion of what genuine learning was always meant to accomplish. Friendships and professional relationships tend to be more direct, less encumbered by unnecessary hedging or unspoken hierarchy, because both parties are relating from something closer to a shared, lateral footing rather than a felt and unexamined vertical arrangement. Perhaps most tellingly, this person's relationship with their own ambitions has become considerably more honest. They pursue what they genuinely want, evaluated on realistic terms, rather than filtered through an inherited sense of what is appropriate for someone at their assumed level. This does not produce reckless or grandiose behavior. Genuine self-assessment, a capacity this person has specifically cultivated, keeps ambition grounded in an accurate understanding of current capability and realistic pathways forward. What it removes is the artificial ceiling that previously operated beneath conscious awareness, quietly filtering out entire categories of possibility before they were ever seriously considered. It is worth being honest in this portrait about what does not disappear entirely, because an inaccurate picture of complete, permanent immunity to comparative feeling would set an unrealistic and ultimately discouraging standard. This person still occasionally notices the old contraction, arising in the presence of someone particularly impressive, still occasionally catches themselves beginning to soften a statement more than the situation actually warrants. Still occasionally feels a flicker of the earlier discomfort described in the chapter on rising to one's own level. The difference is not the complete absence of these old patterns, but the speed and clarity with which they are now recognized, named, and set aside, rather than being obeyed automatically as unquestioned truth the way they once were. Mastery, in this domain as in most others, is not the elimination of an old pattern's occasional appearance, but the development of a reliable, practiced response whenever that appearance occurs. This portrait, taken as a whole, describes not a finished, static achievement, but an ongoing orientation. A person who continues encountering impressive people, difficult comparisons, and moments of genuine uncertainty about their own standing, while meeting all of it from a considerably steadier internal position than the one they began with. The ladder described in the opening chapter of this journey has not been destroyed so much as revealed for what it always was, a shared story rather than a fixed structure, and this person has simply stopped treating that story as more authoritative than their own considered, internally sourced sense of who they are and what they are capable of becoming. Chapter 18. Rising to your own level. Permanently every idea explored across this journey converges, finally, on a single practical question that deserves direct and honest treatment before this journey concludes. What does it actually mean, in ongoing, daily terms, to live at one's own level rather than beneath it, not as a single completed event, but as a sustained and permanent way of moving through the world? This closing chapter is concerned with that question specifically, gathering the separate threads examined throughout this journey into a coherent, lasting understanding. It is worth beginning by the particular misunderstanding that could easily form from everything discussed so far. The assumption that rising to one's own level represents a destination eventually reached, and then permanently occupied without further effort. This is not an accurate picture of how genuine internal change actually functions. The invisible ladder described at the very beginning of this journey was built gradually, over years, through countless small, repeated moments of comparison, deference, and self-diminishment. It would be inconsistent to expect that structure, built so gradually, to dissolve permanently through a single, decisive realization. What actually happens, for most people undertaking this work honestly, is not a single transformation, but an ongoing practice, a continued willingness to notice the old pattern whenever it resurfaces, and to respond to it differently than before, repeated enough times that the newer, more accurate response gradually becomes the default rather than the exception. This ongoing quality is not a discouraging feature of the process, but, properly understood, a reassuring one. It means that occasional relapses into the old pattern, moments of unexpected smallness in the presence of someone impressive, moments of unnecessary deference offered out of old habit rather than genuine current belief, do not represent failure or evidence that the work has not taken hold. They represent the ordinary, expected texture of any deeply ingrained pattern being gradually replaced, a process that proceeds through repetition and accumulated evidence, rather than through a single, permanent conversion that never requires attention again. With that understanding established, it becomes possible to describe, with genuine practical clarity, what living at one's own level actually involves on a sustained basis. It involves the habitual practice of noticing comparison as it arises, and meeting it with the informed skepticism developed throughout this journey, recognizing it as an automatic, largely unreliable process rather than a genuine verdict about worth. It involves the ongoing cultivation of self-reference as the primary system for generating confidence, regularly checking one's own progress against one's own documented history, rather than against the visible, curated positions of others. It involves the continued practice of claiming self-permission before action, treating external input as valuable information, rather than as a required precondition for proceeding. It involves the deliberate maintenance of lateral relationships wherever possible, standing beside rather than beneath, while remaining honest about which relationships genuinely support this lateral footing and which quietly require a return to the old, smaller posture in order to continue functioning as they had before. And it involves the sustained investment in an internally sourced foundation, built from demonstrated resilience, honest self-assessment, and genuine coherence between stated values and actual behavior. A foundation that requires far less external maintenance than the comparative structure it has gradually come to replace. None of this, it is worth emphasizing clearly at this closing point, requires the elimination of admiration for others, nor does it require pretending that genuine differences in skill, experience, or accomplishment do not exist across different people at different points in their respective journeys. Those differences are real and worth acknowledging honestly wherever they appear. What this entire journey has been concerned with dismantling is not the recognition of genuine difference, but the automatic, unexamined conversion of that recognition into a permanent, general verdict about comparative worth, a conversion that was never actually warranted by the evidence, and that has quietly cost countless people years of unnecessary smallness they were never required to carry in the first place. There is a specific image worth holding on to as this journey concludes, an image that captures the essential shift explored across every preceding chapter. It is the image of a person standing not on a ladder at all, but on level ground that simply happens to stretch in every direction, populated by other people, some of whom have walked further in certain directions, some of whom have developed skills not yet developed by the person observing them, but none of whom occupy a fundamentally higher position on any shared vertical structure that would justify permanent deference. This ground does not require anyone to shrink in order for someone else to stand tall upon it. It accommodates every genuine achievement, every demonstrated skill, every hard-won piece of wisdom, without requiring the observer to fall beneath it in order to make room. Choosing to stand on this ground, deliberately and repeatedly, whenever the old, familiar pull toward the invisible ladder reasserts itself, is what rising to one's own level actually means in ongoing, practical terms. It is not a single achievement, claimed once and then permanently secured. It is a daily orientation, renewed through countless small decisions. The decision to notice comparison rather than obey it. The decision to measure progress against one's own history rather than someone else's curated position. The decision to claim permission internally rather than waiting for it to be granted. The decision to offer relationships a lateral footing rather than an automatic, unexamined deference. Each of these decisions, small on its own, accumulates over time into exactly the kind of stable, self-sourced standing this entire journey has been building toward from its opening pages. The invisible ladder that opened this journey does not disappear from the world simply because one person has stopped climbing it in their own mind. Other people will continue constructing their own versions of it, and the broader culture will continue reinforcing comparative thinking through countless subtle and not so subtle mechanisms. But a person who has done the work described throughout this journey no longer needs that ladder to exist or to disappear in order to find their footing. They have found something more durable than the absence of hierarchy around them. A settled, internally verified sense of their own standing, available regardless of who else happens to be in the room, regardless of what that room's unspoken story about status happens to be, and regardless of how impressive, accomplished, or admired anyone else within it might genuinely be. This is what it means, finally and permanently, to stop looking up and to rise, steadily and without apology, to the level that was always, rightfully, one's own to claim.